Raven and the Tide Lady, adapted from a traditional native story, illustrated by Michaela Goad. Raven and the Tide Lady. Raven and the Tide Lady, adapted from a traditional native story, illustrated by Michaela Goad. Foreword. Raven the Trickster. Trickster is found in oral traditions throughout North America and elsewhere in the world. Among many Native Americans, the trickster takes the form of coyote or raven. Among Alaska's indigenous population, he is Raven. Among the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian of southeast Alaska, he is especially prominent as segments of these societies identify themselves as Raven through their moiety or clan affiliation. These Raven individuals recognize an affinity with the natural Raven. The non-Raven natives joke about Raven and his antics as if the Raven individuals are responsible for his naughty behavior. Evidence of the antiquity of Raven stories may be reflected in archaeological artifacts. A few pointed beak birds appear among stone or bone archaeological artifacts dating between 4,000 and 1,000 years ago. In Northwest Coast art design, Raven is depicted with a pointed black beak, while eagles have a curved beak. Raven stories were well developed among Southeast Alaskan natives. When the earliest visitors to the region, some 200 years ago, heard these oral narratives, the significance of Raven is evident not only in Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian oral traditions, but in their visual and performing arts as well. Natives are quick to point out that Raven is not a god, although he is credited with bringing many benefits to humanity through his deeds and more often his mischievous misdeeds. This inconsistency in behavior between benevolent and malevolent is reflected in the dual personality of Raven as a culture hero and Raven as a trickster. Raven enters a world that was already in existence, but through his actions he rearranges or transforms the created world. Raven as culture hero and Raven as trickster change the physical features of animals and the landscape, but Raven as trickster satisfies his desires at the expense of others. Raven stories continue to be popular among the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. The original stories are complex, humorous, and sometimes filled with raucous sexual adventures. Raven stories are not about what is viewed as proper behavior, but what is unacceptable behavior. Raven stories, in their entirety, are not always appropriate for young readers. However, as our oral traditions on Raven are a significant element of Southeast Alaskan Native cultures, Sealaska Heritage Institute's Baby Raven Read Books, which SHI first began publishing in 2016, were developed to introduce young readers to these stories. They have also been adapted to be an age appropriate for younger readers. In its 2018 Baby Raven Reads series, SHI adapted a trilogy of Raven stories in which he acts both a culture hero and trickster. In Raven and the Tide Lady, Raven fights with Tide Lady to bring low tide to allow humans and animals to gather food. In Raven loses his nose, his greediness results in a temporary loss of his nose, and in Raven makes the Aleutians, his ingenuity leads to the creation of the Aleutian chain. These stories were adapted from the works of the late Nora and Richard Duenhauer, who transcribed the stories from elders' oral accounts. Sealaska Heritage Institute in the future will be publishing a compilation of Tlingit Raven stories that were collected and edited by Nora and Richard Duenhauer. These stories are owned by Southeast Alaskan natives, and thanks to the relentless work of these two scholars, Raven stories will be told long into the future. Rosita Kahani Worrell, Ph.D., President, Sealaska Heritage Institute. A little old lady controlled the tide. She never let the tide go down low. Raven was determined to bring back the low tide so foods could be gathered from the beach. Raven saw the Tide Lady sitting on the tide and began to think. He went to the beach and walked along the bull kelp. He put his head in the water, trying to get a sea urchin, but he could not reach it. Then Raven saw Mink. "Mink, can you bring me a sea urchin?" asked Raven. Mink dived underwater and surfaced with a beautiful shell, round like a ball, but covered in small spikes. Raven ate the delicate meat of the urchin and drank its juice. Then he went to the Tide Lady, who was asleep by the fire, and said, "Hey, look what I have." The Tide Lady was not happy to see Raven with the spiny shell. She asked Raven, "When was the tide so low you could get a sea urchin?" With a stick she chased Raven away. Then the Tide Lady went back to sleep as the fire crackled and popped at her back. Raven returned and said, "I'm chilled from the juice of the sea urchin. May I sit by the fire?" "No, Juke! Get out of here!" "Please, I am chilled from the juice of the sea urchin. Please let me sit by the fire." The Tide Lady was angry. She did not understand how Raven had harvested a sea urchin. "No, Juke, you cannot sit by the fire." She raised her stick again. Raven took the stick away. He began poking the Tide Lady with the spiny sea urchin shell until she hollered, "Stop now, Raven, let me go." Raven said, "Not until you let the tide go. Let it go back down." The Tide Lady relented. Okay, Raven, I will let the tide down." But Raven held on to the Tide Lady and hollered, "Where are you, Gidzanooks? Gidzanooks, go down to check the tide." Gidzanooks returned, "Raven, the tide is as low as half a man." Raven called his crew. "What do you see at the shore?" "We see gumboots in the tide pools," they hollered. "And now," called Raven, "we can gather seaweed on the rocks." "And now," called Raven, "we can rake the sand for clams and cockles." "And now," called Raven, "we are picking sea urchins at the edge of the surf," the crew hollered. Raven called Magpie. "Go down and check the tide." Magpie hollered, "Raven, the entire beach is almost dry. I will drop a line for gray cod." So Raven let the Tide Lady go. Raven invited everyone to gather food. As Raven strung up 1, 2, 3 gray cod, he instructed the Tide Lady, "From this day the tide will come up high to the trees before going back down. The tide will stop in 8 places when it is going down." This would help everyone. They could now predict the tide and know when to gather food. Now Raven was tired and hungry. He filled up 1 cod stomach with seal grease, lay down and allowed the grease to drip into his mouth to reward his hard work. The Tide Lady kept her promise and let the tide rise and fall. Today, when the tide is low, we can go down to the beach and gather clams, gumboots, sea urchins, seaweed, and much more. Text notes. Juke, scram! Gidzanooks. This is the name of one of the members of Raven's crew. It is used consistently by many renowned storytellers, but its meaning is unclear. Sea urchins. Sea urchins are highly valued as a culinary delicacy in Southeast Alaska Native culture, so much so that there is a verb dedicated to describing their collection. A side effect of consuming sea urchins as well as some other shellfish is that one becomes cold. It is for this reason that Raven complains of being cold. and then squats down by the fire across from the Tide Lady. Oral tradition. Raven stories are ancient creation stories based on oral history that have been passed from generation to generation for thousands of years. Traditional stories document Native history, reflect Native worldviews, and are highly valued clan possessions that are integral to Native identity. For the Baby Raven Reads program, some of these traditional stories were adapted from oral accounts into children's books.